On Talking Royals this week, Chris and Lizzie are out of the studio and in Canada for the King's visit for the opening of Canadian Parliament.
Every time I come to Canada, a little more of Canada seeps into my bloodstream, and from there, straight to my heart.
So, how did it go, and what's the feedback been?
Something was definitely weighing heavily on him.
He really, really does love this country and love being here, and I think the visit has meant a lot to Canadians.
And just how worried are the Canadians regarding Donald Trump?
We felt very vulnerable when they started to threaten to make us the 51st state.
And do you see this visit as the King supporting Canada in its fight?
Yes, absolutely.
Hello and welcome to Talking Royals. As you can see, I'm not in the studio. And guess what? Neither is Chris or Lizzie. Because if you were listening last week, you would know that they were heading off to Canada. And that's where you join us now. How's it been?
It has been, as ever, busy, interesting, and you know what? A bit of history was made here. If you look at any of the Canadian coverage of their king visiting Canada yesterday, it was wall to wall. It's almost like they'd never seen the king before, but they were kind of bowled over by the visit.
Yeah, it was a whistle-stop tour. I'm not over-egging it when I call this a whistle-stop tour. The King and Queen were in Canada for just 24 hours, touching down on Monday and gone again by Tuesday lunchtime. And of course, the visit was an incredibly significant one. It was the King's first as a monarch, as King of Canada, and also it was only the second time that a monarch has delivered the speech at the opening of Parliament. So a really, really important visit, despite being a short one. And sort of aides we've spoken to before we arrived in Canada said that they were hoping that despite how quick it was, they were hoping it would be impactful. And I think watching sort of all the coverage here and the response, I think it's fair to say that it was impactful.
Well, we'll get to what sort of welcome they had from members of the public. We'll get to that a little bit later on, because I know we mentioned that last week. But what we keep saying over and over again since Chris predicted it a few weeks ago was, as he said, it's been 70 years since, 70 years actually, when Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip opened the new session of Parliament back in 1957. So it's historic for many, many different reasons. But also it's quite, I don't know, a sensitive time diplomatically for Canada, the UK and America.
Yeah, so much to talk about, really. And actually, a number of Canadians have kind of said to us, you guys, not just the Brits, but the rest of the world tend to forget about us. We're North America's nearest neighbour. What do we care about the Canadians? A lot of people will be saying, suddenly, people have taken notice of us. Why? Well, because Donald Trump's been claiming that he wants to make Canada the 51st state. He went very quiet on that for a little while, ever since the new Prime Minister here, Mark Carney, went to the White House and said, oi, Canada's not for sale and never will be. But actually, after the King's speech yesterday, and everyone here, Lizzie, weren't they, were going, I wonder whether the White House is watching. Is the White House going to watch what the King's saying? Is Donald Trump going to see it? Guess what? Last night, Donald Trump tweeted or Truth Socialed, however he gets his words out these days, that Canada could have that new missile defence system, the Golden Dome, for free if they were part of America and were the 51st state. And suddenly he's back making, that's my phone going on the floor, but anyway, he's back making the threats that the Canadians were very worried about. And actually, Lizzie, I suppose we said this on News at 10 last night, we kind of, you on our side of the Atlantic, Charlene, you kind of do underestimate how worried Canadians are and how vulnerable they've been feeling since Donald Trump has been making these threats.
So often we say timing is everything, and this visit has just happened to fall at an incredibly significant time for Canada. I think, the King probably would have come to Canada much earlier had it have not been for his cancer diagnosis. He probably would have been here last spring. And then originally it was unlikely that he'd be able to get here this year because the elections were due to be much later in the year, so he wouldn't have been able to visit. Then when Mark Carney brought the elections forward, it sort of paved the way to open up and allow a royal visit to happen, and it happens to be at such an important time given what's going on politically and with Donald Trump. Of course, the King is politically neutral. He sits above politics. He's had a real diplomatic tightrope to walk while he's been here, but the timing is significant, and that has sort of worked out quite well, I think. And for Canadians that we've spoken to while he's been here, it's been really important and valuable to have their King here at such a sort of sensitive and difficult time for them.
I guess what you were saying earlier, Chris, about the fact that a lot of Canadians really are very worried about what will happen regarding Trump. And I guess we don't really sense that to that degree being in the UK. But in terms of how much it meant to them having the King come over, do they feel, grateful? Are they excited? Do they feel as though they are part of something that may well protect them from Trump?
Yeah, there's two things there. One, they saw 100% this was the King coming over to lend his support to Canada. Now, there's also this issue, which, by the way, Canadians have clocked, that the King, as King of the UK, has invited Donald Trump to come over for this, as Keir Starmer called it, an unprecedented second state visit. Now, to separate out those two things, the Canadians really happy that he came, thought it was amazing. They were kind of hoping the White House was watching, because we all know how big a fan Donald Trump is of the royal family. And this was Canada saying, well, guess what, Mr. Trump? He's our king, and he's come over to our parliament, and there he is on his throne in our Senate, giving a speech that our government has written. What I think is the issue for Canadians is, well, hold on a minute, this is the same guy who said to Donald Trump, come over to the UK and I'm going to give you a wonderful state visit, and you're the only US president who's ever done it twice. And that's gone down very badly. And Lizzie, with one of the people we spoke to outside the Senate yesterday, thought the whole thing was amazing. But when I mentioned this state visit to the UK, she said, no, we were not impressed with that. And I said, do you want him to be disinvited? Do you want the King to disinvite Donald Trump? And she said, absolutely, yes, we do.
Well, in terms of protesters, in the midst of all of this, were there protesters on the streets that didn't want the King to be around, considering what sort of atmosphere they're in at the moment?
Look, I think they were very, very warmly welcomed to Canada on Monday. Their first event was a community event somewhere called Lansdowne Park, not far from the airport where they landed, and they were received. They were sort of basically mobbed. People were incredibly excited to have them here. There were a handful, and I stress handful, like one or two protesters among the crowd saying, not my king. But I would say, if you were looking at the overall reaction to the King and Queen's arrival in Canada, it was an incredibly positive one. The majority of people we've spoken to over the last couple of days have been incredibly pleased to have him here, although, as Chris says, they are not very impressed about the idea of Donald Trump coming to the UK for a second state visit. But the King has to navigate both of those issues carefully, and I think he has achieved that.
Charlene, Palace sources were telling us before the visit, it is important to separate out the King's two roles, one as head of state of Canada and one as head of the state of the UK. And of course there is that kind of bleed in between them, which has caused this bit of an issue about the state visit to the UK. But they kind of say, look, the King is here as King of Canada. He's not here as King of the UK, and he's here to come and support the Canadians. There was an interesting point, though, Charlene, I don't know what you think about this, that I heard on the TV last night, when people were saying, hold on a minute, here you've got the new Prime Minister saying, we're an independent sovereign country, keep that billionaire, in America away from us. And yet those people who are not so keen on monarchy were saying, well, why do we have this link with a billionaire monarch in London who's our head of state and he doesn't even live here? So, that is an issue that inevitably does come to the fore, just as perhaps it did in Australia when we were there.
Well, yeah, and I think we've talked about this so many times about the various countries that want to perhaps relook at their connections with the royal family, and they're having a king as their head of state. And I think as time goes on, those discussions will become louder and those discussions will become more frequent. But then people look at whether it is a benefit to them anymore to have that. But then when you've got Trump and America next door, you're almost stuck, one could say, stuck between a rock and a hard place. Which direction is the best one for you to go in?
Yeah, and you know what? I spoke to a community elder, a leader of the Inuit community here. So, there are a number of indigenous groups, First Nations, Inuit and Métis here in Canada. And he was saying, yeah, okay, we've got some difficult issues with the British Crown that go back, many, many decades. But actually, this is a moment, and this is a words from an Inuit leader, this is a moment to unite around the Crown in opposition to Donald Trump. So they saw the King, actually, interestingly, Charlene, as a unifying force, as opposed to the old colonial power that did some bad things way back when. And
actually, just picking up on that point that Chris just made, the speech that the King gave yesterday from the throne, it is on the advice of the Canadian government. It is setting out the legislative agenda. But within that speech, he said the Crown is a symbol of unity and it represents stability and continuity.
Interesting. Well, on that note, Lizzie, let's take a listen to another part from the speech.
It is with a deep sense of pride and pleasure that my wife and I join you here today as we witness Canadians coming together in a renewed sense of national pride, unity, and hope. While the world faces unprecedented challenges, generating uncertainties across the continents with regards to peace and stability, economics and climate change, your communities have the skills and determination to bring a wealth of solutions.
Well, he's not mincing his words there, one could argue, trying to say something without saying something and continuing to be politically neutral. It's not easy for the King, right?
No, and you remember, this is a speech, just like in the UK, Charlene, when the government writes it for the King and he just comes along and reads the government's words, and whether he agrees with them or not, he's got to read them. I kind of felt here, and we were told this, it was a little bit different. There is a bit of room to have a bit of personal reflection in there, although, we haven't played to our UK viewers the bit about, the government's new housing policy in Canada that the King had to read, and all those other things. But so we were picking out all the bits that, were part of the sort of geopolitics at the moment, which is we need a stronger defence force so we can build up our defences. We've relied too much on America. We know there's instability in global trade, and the King said Canadians feel very these are very uncertain times. They feel vulnerable, and I think, and I said before about the way in which on our side of the Atlantic we don't really get this, but I think the King, with all the connections that he has, he of course speaks to his Governor General here all the time, he really does understand what this has all meant to Canadians. And even last night, just before we did News at 10, that lady that came up to us and just said, we're worried about the United States attacking us. I never thought I'd actually say that. This is why we need to have a bigger army. We can't rely on the United States anymore. And I kind of, you get into the Canadian mindset, as you inevitably do for a very short period of time when we come on these trips, you see things a little differently to how we've been seeing them in the UK.
Yeah, you'll notice he didn't say anywhere in the speech, he didn't refer to Donald Trump, he didn't refer to him suggesting about the annexing of Canada as the 51st state, but he didn't need to. He is, when you speak to people around the King, his aides, they say, this is a man that really understands the job that he has to do and navigating, these diplomatic areas. He knows that he has to sit above politics and how to navigate that, and he has done here. And I think just by being here and by delivering that speech, which is, as I said earlier, an incredibly rare thing to happen, has meant an awful lot to Canadians. But for the King, he has a great love and affection for this country. It was his 20th visit here. He said in the speech about how every time he visits here, a little bit of more of Canada seeps into his bloodstream, and then to his heart, he really, really does love this country and love being here. And I think the visit, although it was short, has meant a lot to Canadians and has been, made a real difference to them.
And Charlene, that's the point when we should probably talk about the King's emotion. What did you think about some of those pictures? Which actually, the cameraman who's sat behind the camera very dutifully right now, Kevin, caught these images of the King yesterday, just looking really, really emotional. And just as well as we do, Charlene, that's quite unusual for members of the royal family to let their feelings show through.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was incredibly, heartwarming and quite a sensitive and real moment that you saw from him. And I don't think it's something that he meant to do necessarily, but we've spoken before about how many different trips he's done to Canada, the amount of different activities he's done in Canada. When he says that he has this connection, I don't feel like he's making that up. And I guess, when you've been through what he's been through the past few months, the last couple of years, I guess you do view things slightly differently. And those places that mean the most to you, being able to still travel there, being able to still stand in Parliament and give those speeches, I guess that has more poignancy perhaps than it's ever had before. And I suppose the thought of that being taken away would have even more poignancy.
Yeah, and we were standing very close to the King actually when he was outside Parliament, and I do what we often do, film things on your mobile phone, and you never really get as close with this lens. But Kevin's lens really caught the King. He was standing there. There was both the Canadian national anthem was played and the British national anthem, and he kind of, didn't he, Lizzie, looked up at the sky, the sort of, we shouldn't overanalyze these things, and who knows what's going on in his mind, but he looked up at the sky, his sort of tongue was going into his cheek as if he was just feeling a bit overcome by the whole thing. Again, really unusual to see a member of the royal family do that kind of thing. We don't know what's going on, clearly, but something was definitely weighing heavily on him at that moment.
Yeah, and that emotion, I think, we heard coming through in the speech as well from the King. As he got to the very, very end of the speech, his voice just cracked ever so slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but when you listen back, you definitely can hear it, and we can play that to you now.
May you honour the profound trust bestowed upon you by Canadians. And may God bless and guide you in all your duties.
And another thing just to mention about the end of the speech, which was picked up very widely here and in the UK, was when the King said that the true North is indeed strong and free. That went down incredibly well with those listening to him. There was a huge standing ovation, wasn't there?
Yeah, you wonder whether that was the bit after he said that tipped him over the edge slightly, because there was that long applause. It was a bit. You remember Italy, Charlene, when actually everyone started clapping, hadn't quite got to the end of his speech. It was a little bit like that. He said from the famous line from the Canadian anthem, "The true North, strong and free." He said the true North is indeed strong and free.
As the anthem reminds us, the true North is indeed strong and free.
That kind of is the clip that's being played again and again and again here in Canada for the way in which that was the King showing his support for Canada's sovereignty and independence.
Of course, he was invited over by Mark Carney, and I can imagine that entire speech and the way it was delivered and the reaction to it was exactly what Mark Carney wanted to see. That's what he had hoped for. So let's hear from him now.
It was a very successful visit, a good reminder of the strength of Canadian institutions. Really, this is about Canadian institutions. The King is the King of Canada, and you see the enthusiasm for those institutions. And even for me, as much as your viewers as much as your viewers might not believe it.
Do you know what, though? There's something that you said earlier, Chris, which I think will sit with me, because it's very difficult for us Brits to understand what it's like when you don't live on an island. So we live on an island, we don't border anywhere that's going to, cross over the border and perhaps attack us. Obviously, I'm not saying that's going to happen in any shape or form, but when you said you spoke to the lady outside Parliament, and she had said, we are very fearful that they could just attack us and attack us at the border, they feel like it's a very real threat, and perhaps the reassurance from the king is exactly what they needed at this moment.
Yeah, it's really odd. Again, and this is why it's important to come to places, because you do get a different sense of how they see the world. And Canada's the second largest country by landmass, so only second after Russia. It's got 40 million people that live here. And actually, if you go right up into the north, into the Arctic, the border between Canada and Greenland is very small. It's separated by that much sea. Well, it looks like that much on a map. But therefore, when Donald Trump's saying, I'm going to own Greenland and I'm going to own Canada, you can see why they feel so threatened by it. A big country, but economically inferior to the United States in terms of population, a lot fewer people than the United States. And even anecdotally, while we've been here, evidence that they are doing things differently. We have to eat when we're here, Charlene. So when we were in a restaurant, I'm not saying that these trips are all about eating food, but listen to what Lizzie can explain what one of the waitresses in a restaurant said to her about the wine that we weren't drinking.
Yeah, we were just having a chat actually, as we sort of have been with Canadians while we've been here, and Chris is right, it is only when you get here you really get a sense of just how anxious Canadians were. We were in this restaurant and chatting, and they said that they used to stock a lot of wine from America, and now that they are running down their supplies, and that they won't buy from there anymore, and that they will stock their wine from other countries around the world. And I thought that was really interesting.
So Charlene, have a listen to these people that we spoke to on the day that they arrived. I was just talking to this crowd of Canadians who were fiercely proud independent, and it turns out that somebody standing next to them was, guess what, an American. So we kind of asked how on earth did they let you in here? So have a listen to the conversation I had with these crowds.
I think America is overstepped its grounds right now, and a lot of Canadians are fearful.
Right.
And
do you see this visit as the king supporting Canada in its fight?
Yes, absolutely. It means a lot to Canada right now, because we felt very vulnerable when they started to threaten to make us the 51st state.
Right.
There was a concern about the decline of the importance of the monarchy with the transition to the king.
Yeah.
And this has completely turned it around.
If I can make a sort of political analogy, in the same way that Canadians swung behind Mark Carney in the election, do you think it's been a turning point in support for the monarchy?
Oh, absolutely. It's remarkable. This guy, who's American,
How did they let you in here?
I'm one of the good ones. We know that Donald Trump is susceptible to flattery, and he's a fan of the royal family and whatnot. So I hope that he will get the message that Canada is a different country from the United States, and they're very happy being a different country from the United States.
It's not going to be the 51st state anytime soon.
Absolutely not.
Canada has a strong head of state, a strong prime minister, and
your head of state is a king who lives in London.
Yeah, well,
still doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, no, it makes sense because he cares for us, and we are together, unity, which U.S. right now doesn't have it.
Wow. Okay. Very honest opinions there outside. But on the whole, though, guys, a successful triple round?
Oh yeah, short, successful, impactful. I kind of sound like a press officer in Buckingham Palace, so maybe. But no, it was all those things. And actually, to see how Canadians have seen this, and this historic address, it hasn't happened since 1957, so that's nearly 70 years ago. The Canadians really, really, really appreciated the visit, no matter how small it was. And actually, it was actually organised in a very short period of time. These trips normally take years, months to plan, but this was done in little under 6 weeks because Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister, said, hey, Mr. King, why didn't you come over and see us?
Yeah, which I think is why it was kept so short. I think, they packed an awful lot into to their 24-hour visit, but it was really put together at pace. So that's why it was as short as it was.
Really odd, Charlie, that Mark Carney was standing there where people were going, we love you, Carney, like you would just never necessarily get in the UK, and he was kind of waving at these crowds. So he's enjoying that ride that some politicians sometimes get, and it doesn't last very long, as we know, but he's enjoying that popularity at the moment.
Yeah, I was about to say, as we all know, it doesn't last very long at all, so you should enjoy it for the moment. Right, before I let you go, as you know, you go on royal tours and you're supposed to bring me something back. So what are you bringing me back this time, since I'm not with you?
We wouldn't want to ruin that surprise. We'd like to do that in person.
Yeah, let me see if I can see his shop down there somewhere where I can buy something. So,
well, I know you're on your way to the airport. But I know you're on the way to the airport, so time is a ticking, guys. You've not got long before you pick me up something nice. Maple syrup, as you just mentioned, will also do. I can put that on pancakes.
All right, promise to get you some.
We'll see you in the studio next week.
Brilliant. We'll see you next week. Yes, that's it for now. Remember, if you're listening and want to see our lovely faces and not just hear our voices, you can watch every single episode on ITVX and on YouTube. And if you're watching and would rather not see our faces, you can listen instead on your favourite podcast platform. If you want to get in touch, any comments you've got regarding the visit to Canada, perhaps. I know that we have some lovely Canadian listeners who engage with us quite a lot. Do let us know what you thought of the visit. Email us at talkingroyals@itv.com. But as always, thank you so much for joining us. The three of us will be reunited in the studio again next week, so we'll see you then.